The DPS meter, the holy source of truth, what I like to refer to as the Bible, because it lets you see things that other people cannot see. Now, historically speaking, Blade & Soul always had DPS meter, but this was removed in the Neo version. And in today's video, I want to go over the pros and cons of the DPS meter and if they should be ultimately bringing it back. Now, in case you didn't know, there is currently a advanced combat tracker plugin for Blade & Soul. It basically go ahead and read your combat log in your text chat and output your DPS for you. However, while it doesn't directly interact or interferes with the game memory, it does read the game memory and is against term of service and could get you banned. So this is not necessarily something I would recommend. Historically speaking, Blade & Soul always had the DPS meter built into the game. In a dungeon, if you enable the DPS meter through a obscure settings, you can see the top 3 DPS in your party and then your own DPS, assuming you're not a part of the top 3 DPS. That means that other people will not be able to see your DPS if you're the bottom 3 DPS. Likewise, if you're doing a 12-man raid, you'll be able to see the top 6 DPS and you will not know who's the bottom 6 DPS. But the DPS meter never truly reflected your contribution in a party. Someone who is doing the mechanics is significantly more valuable than someone who is just pumping damage. As the result of someone who is focused on mechanics, their damage output could be a lot smaller just because they're more concentrated on doing other things in the fight than pumping damage out. The DPS meter also doesn't reflect contribution when it comes down to applying status or buff like that. As a blade dancer, it is my responsibility to consistently apply bleed onto the boss because this reduces the enemy combat health regen by 20%. It basically means that your party is doing 20% more damage by applying bleed because you're preventing the enemy from regenerating it back. Likewise, as a blade dancer, I'm able to consistently knock down and CC the boss and then grab the boss so that the boss stay in one place while the rest of the team full free DPS with unlimited focus uptime. This is an overall massive increase for the party DPS, but it does come as a sacrifice of my own DPS. So as a result, my own DPS on the DPS meter will go down while everyone else will go up. And so therefore, the DPS meter never truly represents the full picture. This is the biggest problem with the ACT plugin. It's going to fail to account for many things because it is not built into the game. It doesn't count your status damage, it doesn't count your soul core damage and stuff like that, and it's going to easily misrepresent how much damage everyone else is doing in your party or maybe even your own damage. And most importantly, because it shows everyone all 6 DPS compared to historical DPS meter where it only showed the top 3, people would easily use this as a weapon of be like, this person is doing the least damage, let's kick him out and stuff like that. However, to be fair though, Blade & Soul Neo is quite challenging in comparison to the original live versions. Your party need to meet a pretty high DPS requirement in order to compete dungeon, at least on the initial release. That means that all 6 of your members need to have the relevant gear, min-max stat and stuff like that, as well as most importantly playing really well doing the rotation on point in order to clear a dungeon. And DPS meter will help you indicate these things if they're being met or not. One of the biggest reasons why Blade & Soul is really fun is because the combat is really dynamic and they actually matter. The way you play, how well you play dramatically influences your damage, and without something like a DPS meter, it might be very hard for a new player to visualize what they're doing wrong or if they're even doing anything wrong. Since there's no indicator they're doing anything wrong, they also don't have the desire to improve or look up what they should be doing in order to actually do damage. If you go into lower level dungeon and party with newer player or beginner player, you will often find that they're making very obvious mistakes that are dramatically hurting their damage, but because there's no indicator that they're making any mistakes, because there's no one calling them out, because there's nothing to hold them accountable, often they don't even know that their damage is suffering dramatically because of these things. If a DPS meter were to be in the game, then new player can visualize that the damage difference between them and their party member, and that would be the first step of potentially improving, whether that be gear or playstyles. They ask themselves, hey, how come my party member is doing so much more damage than I am? And that will be the first step of any kind of improvement. But on the other hand, the DPS meter is one of the most consistent and reliable way to measure your personal progress and how strong you really are by doing something what we like to call the DPS parse, which is basically doing your entire rotation on a dummy in the Mushin Tower and measuring your overall DPS in a long fight. Because there's so many different sources of damage in a game like this, from attack power to critical rate, critical damage, your bash progress, your soul, how well you play and doing your rotation and stuff like that, and most importantly, of course, skill books. Doing something like a purple skill book not only changes how you play, but also changes the scaling on the skills, and none of these are easily measurable. One of the biggest problems of the game right now, especially for a new player, is that it's very hard to gauge how strong you really are and how much damage you'd really be doing. And these are important questions for yourself to answer so that you can understand what's lacking in your character build and where you can improve your damage and stuff like that. Of course, one of the most common strategy of improving your own characters is to look at other people playing the exact same class and see what they're doing to improve their characters. But even then, how do you know exactly what is the difference between you and their characters? And most importantly, what category you need to improve to catch up to their characters? Looking at this person who I just found in the Motion Tower, do you know if this person's character is stronger than me, or if I'm stronger than this person? And in this case, what makes it so that I am stronger than this person? For example, they have legendary accessories, but these are not very good. That's one line of critical rate here, and that's one line of critical damage here. On the other hand, I have purple accessories, but these are fully upgraded true siren accessories. It has both critical rate and critical damage, and my critical rate is already higher than what they have on the legendary. So how do you say which one of us is stronger? This answer is without a good measurement like a DPS meter, you can't. And likewise, this person have a Moonwater Soul badge, a Desert Mystic badge, and I don't even have a Mystic badge because it turned out Mystic badge is not a very good improvement for Windblade Dancer, so I opt to just not use a Mystic badge at all. The DPS measurement is a very good indicator of where you're at currently in the game and where you should be at and what you can do to improve your characters. If you see someone with higher critical rate doing more damage than you, then that's an indicator that you should work on your critical rate and stuff like that. For this reason, almost every single game with a DPS meter end up using the parts as a metric to get into party. For example, game like Maple Story or Final Fantasy XIV all uses this to recruit people into your party, where you'll post your DPS parts, what we like to call the battle analysis in Maple Story, and then this is the true metric of how strong your characters really is. And for people who are trying to clear content for real, it is a much more reliable metric than trying to create a party like this, because you don't really know how strong someone really is. Just for example, picking on this person, how am I supposed to know how strong they are? Because they have a good amount of blue skills, but also not a lot. They do have 8 masteries, have a good amount of attack power, critical rate, critical damage. So I can only guess that they are fairly strong, but it's hard for me to tell how strong. And this is also one of the biggest reasons why I have started the Neo Looking for Group Discourse, to help people find party where people are actually holding each other accountable in terms of their stat and stuff like that. But one of the biggest benefits when it comes down to having a DPS meter visualizable in-game is for tanking. A lot of people like to talk about how tanking is not a thing in Blade & Soul Neo, but that's not true. It absolutely is, just the old school fashion without the threat skills. The way tanking is supposed to work is that the tank would go in first to build aggro to generate threat by doing damage to the boss, and then everyone else should hold off their DPS and make sure that they're not over-threating by over-DPSing the tank so that the tank can maintain aggro. And this is extremely important moving forward in Blade & Soul Neo. In the latest CN dungeon, you can see that tanking is extremely relevant and important because the tank have to direct the boss, and this is also one of the biggest reasons why I have started the Neo Looking for Group Discourse, to help people find party where people are actually holding each other accountable in terms of their stat and stuff like that. It is actually mentioned by the Chinese player that this entire fight is heavily dependent on how good your tank is, if they're able to do the mechanics properly and stuff like that. And so tanking is extremely relevant in this dungeon. Obviously, the CN BNS version is a little different, and we don't exactly know if we're going to be getting a dungeon like this, but I'll be doing a showcase of this dungeon and explain the mechanics very soon, so be sure to subscribe to the channel if you're not yet already. Overall, it is hard to say if Blade & Soul should bring back the original DPS meter. I did really like how the original DPS meter only showed the top 3 DPS, so I feel like it helped eliminate some toxicity, because at the current moment, to be very honest, most of the top player already have the third-party plugin to see people DPS, which is kind of understandable, because if you want to clear the latest dungeon, then it is true that at the current moment, you need everyone to keep up. And so it is the only realistic way to clear the latest dungeon, but at the same time, it does create a lot of toxicity, especially with how the third-party plugin DPS is not the most accurate thing, as it doesn't represent things like status, it doesn't represent things like party buff and stuff like that. I would really love to hear you guys' status on if the game should have DPS meter or not, and most importantly, is it healthy for the game to have DPS meter or not? So with that being said, leave your comment below about your current status of the DPS meter, and I'll read them, and make sure to subscribe as always. Thanks for watching the video. Bye bye.